Hello, everybody. A couple of years ago, we had the great British historian Richard Overy on the show. He'd just written a book about the Second World War, which he called The Last Imperial War, 1931 to 1945. And we entitled the conversation, Has the Second World War Ended Yet? And of course, given what's happening in Ukraine and perhaps even Palestine, Gaza, one could argue that it hasn't really ended. And we are going to talk about a different kind of war today, 100-year war between Britain or England and France, which happened a long, long time ago, between 1337 and 1453. My guest today on the show has a new book out. It's out in the US today. It's called Bloody Crowns, A New History of the 100 Years' War. It's also out in the UK. The same book has a different title, The 200 Years' War. Interesting difference in titles. Michael is joining us from South Carolina, where he teaches at the Citadel. Michael, let me begin with the same question that I asked Richard Overy. Has the 100-year war or the 100 Years' War, has it ended yet?
Well, I think that kind of depends on your perspective, right? I mean, one of the things that is kind of vital, I think, about this story is, especially when you think about it as a 200 years war, as I've defined it, from 1292 to 1492, this really is what launches us into those kind of imperial wars. So once the wars on the continent end, the wars that we kind of typically think about, you gave the dates 1337 to 1453. Again, I've spread that out a little bit further, but once that ends and England and France are no longer sort of struggling, over France, as it were, the rivalry between them doesn't end. It just moves onto a different landscape, which becomes global, right? 1492 is Columbus and all that. So it really does lay the groundwork for what becomes the imperial colonial wars that, as you rightly said, we continue to grapple with today.
Yeah, and it just as Overy stretched the Second World War, suggesting it took place between 1931 and 1945. So you've done the same, calling it the 200 Years' War, at least in the UK edition. Not everyone, Michael, and you teach at the Citadel, so you're all too familiar with this. Not everyone will be familiar with medieval European history. So give us some background. What exactly was the 100 or the 200 Years' War, whatever you want to call it?
So traditionally, the 100 Years' War, at least as I was taught it back in the day, probably far too long ago for my own comfort these days. But the traditional sense of this is this fight between England and France that we usually see from the perspective of the English. That England was vying for lands on the continent that the French believed were their lands, and that ultimately kind of metastasizes, actually pretty quickly in the traditional accounting, to England actually claiming the throne of France and saying, well, those are our lands. And that then propelling forward for 116 years until 1453, at which point the fight sort of semi-resolves. One of the problems that I had in writing the book was, as soon as I started trying to figure out the narrative, I quickly found that those dates really didn't hold any water. Those dates and even the title of 100 Years of War actually come in 1800. These are not, nobody fighting at the time would have called it that. They wouldn't have recognized that. They didn't think anything had resolved in 1453. There was never a war declared. So this is really a label that has been kind of thrown on the past to deal with this mix, this political and military mix. And the more I kind of tried to think about what that really was, the more I found that you had to broaden the scope to actually get something that had, kind of a semblance of wholeness to it, where a fight really kind of did begin and did end. And that meant pushing it to 200 years and meant talking about this beyond simply the axis of England and France, but also to think about this in terms of what's really going on in Europe entire, because it's a fight that drives what actually comes to define Europe as we deal with it today.
Yeah, you mentioned it was an English war, always thought of as an English war, though as it happens, on Amazon at least, your Bloody Crowns is the #1 new release in French history. I'm not sure about British history, or at least English history. Of course, the idea of Britain didn't exist back then. I just saw Monty Python's Holy Grail, or rewatched it recently. And of course, it presents medieval war as a rather sad group of knights running around, some on horseback, some without, fighting each other. It didn't seem to impact much of the world. Is that what this war was like, Michael? I mean, it certainly wasn't like Stalingrad or the Somme, was it? In terms of its mobilization, its violence, its impact on the world.
Well, I mean, we're talking about 200 years that see the rise of gunpowder, for instance. I mean, gunpowder warfare doesn't exist when this war begins, and does exist by the end of it. I mean, this changes modern warfare. The idea of having a regular army doesn't exist when this war begins. It exists when we come out of it. Modern taxation practices, even the idea of an administrative state, so much of what we think of that defines our modern world, it actually comes from this period. So yeah, it might not be, sort of a single battle may not have quite the numbers of say a Stalingrad. Part of that's, the populations are much smaller, especially when in the middle of all this, the Black Death hits, which has a bit of a downer for populations in Europe. But in terms of its contemporary scale, some of these fights are just massive. And certainly the kind of damage that's being done over the course of 2 centuries of intermittent warfare is extraordinary. It displaces populations. No ruling house of Western Europe survives this unscathed. It changes pretty much everybody, and it's changing the borders. It's defining the borders. It's an absolutely extraordinary period of fighting. We tend to only remember the highlights of it. We think of Edward III in the Battle of Crécy, for instance, or Henry V, Battle of Agincourt, Joan of Arc. So there's an incredible cast of characters, incredible events, but obviously those are just sort of highlight bits of what's a much bigger and much more, I think, extraordinary story that again made our modern world.
Yeah, I want to get to Agincourt and Joan of Arc later. We use these words, France and England, the French and the English, but I know a lot of French historians, for example, have argued that the idea of the French nation was really only forged after or perhaps during the French Revolution, and the idea of England came into being in some ways during the Industrial Revolution, or at least after the English Civil War of the 17th century. Are these words, England and France, helpful in terms of trying to explain this war? Wasn't it a dynastic war in which no one really thought of themselves as English or French? They thought of themselves as parts of families or parts of the church.
I think it certainly starts there, but this is also the story of those things becoming a thing themselves, right? The idea of what it is to be French develops over the course of this. It's a response to what is happening, especially in the 15th century, in the latter stages of this conflict. That's what really lays the seeds to what it means to be French. Now, they're hearkening back to a story that begins long before. We go all the way back to Clovis in like the 5th century. You go way back to the Franks. They're calling back to that past as an identifier of what it means to be French. But certainly in the moment, they are establishing that, actively establishing that. And they're doing so in response to warfare. This is one of the things that kind of happens, for military historians. We see this all the time, that, bringing conflict, actually can kind of determine identifications on either side. And that's exactly what transpires here. Now, the story of the making of the English, when exactly does that start? You can go back to the Battle of Brunanburh in 937 with Athelstan, the first supposed king of the English. There's a lot to that, but you could also argue that it takes another phase of fighting in the English Civil War to codify what that is. but it also depends on what you mean by the English or the French, right? Do you mean the administrative state? Do you mean the people themselves? These words have a kind of nebulousness to them, and that's a problem in that we tend to fight over them, and so we're sometimes fighting over identifications that don't match each other's. But it's also a necessity to deal with each other and to deal with history. Even, I mean, even in kind of retitling this the 200 Years War, I'm well aware that that's kind of a lie, right? I'm putting an artificial end and beginning point.
Story, you're ruining the mythology of historians, Michael. Historians aren't supposed to lie.
Well, it's not. I mean, but it's it's a falsehood to say that like anybody woke up and said, "Oh, now we're doing the 200 Years War," just as it's a falsehood to say that anybody thought, at any whatever year you choose, that somebody looked at their watch and said, "Oh, thank God the Middle Ages are done, and now we can get on with being good people," or now the Industrial Revolution has started. There's never actually a definitive breaking point, right? And so we nevertheless need to talk about periods of history and periods of being and groups of people. And we have to create labels for that. One of the things I hope I'm doing in the book is enabling people to see that fact, right? To see that there is a sort of an artificial quality to this. And I'm at least trying to show my cards, right? This is why I'm using these dates. Here's what the outcome of that is, right? So that we can at least be aware and have a discussion, a transparent discussion about periodization and about the identification of people that isn't possible if we just take for granted that these things have inherent meaning, because they don't.
In other words, history is part mythology, and perhaps the most mythological figure out of this entire mythological 100 or 200 year story is Joan of Arc, who, of course, has been mythologized, sanctified by the French. Some people see her as the founding figure in the ideal of the French nation. Is there really someone called Joan of Arc, Michael? And was she as important as school children are taught about, especially in France, but also in England? I grew up in England, and even we learned about Joan of Arc, even if she was fighting against the English.
Yeah, I mean, there was a Joan. She was extraordinary. Writing about Joan was actually one of the most difficult things in the book, because you're writing about somebody who truly changed history, and she wasn't on the playing board for very long. And it's absolutely unexpected that this would happen. It's an extraordinary flash in the middle of all this that changes everything, and it really happened. Like, she really did exist. The stories about her, I mean, people can push them to somewhat of an extreme, but they're also not far off from reality. I mean, she really was this dynamic figure, and it's hard not to sort of fall for her as a writer.
I mean, would it be fair to call her the MLK or the Thomas Jefferson or the Vladimir Lenin? I mean, what kind of historical analogies might we make of Joan of Arc? And of course, she was a woman in an age where women generally didn't shape history formally.
She's a woman. She's young. She's largely uneducated. This is somebody who
was she as glamorous as she's been portrayed?
Lord, I mean, look, we have no idea what she really looked like. We have no idea any of that. But she is someone who comes out of nowhere, pretty much, and changes history. Could the English have won this conflict before Joan of Arc? Maybe. I don't think they could have, but maybe. After Joan of Arc, they can't. It's done. They're going to lose. It's just going to take time to run.
What is the narrative of Joan? Did she object to the brutality of the British invader, the English invaders? Was she a proto-nationalist? Was she a feminist? What's the story of Joan of Arc?
Joan, because of the kind of nebulousness of our sources, Joan becomes what we want her to be. What she is in a kind of rock solid facts is she's this young woman who claims that God has given her mission to get the English the hell out of France. And it's going to start with relieving this awful siege of the city of Orleans. And she does that. She convinces the Dauphin, the man who would be the king of France but hasn't been crowned. She convinces him to give her support. She goes to Orleans and convinces the people to rally behind her, and they believe her. They believe in her. And my students will sometimes say, do I think she was really speaking to angels and that sort of stuff? And I'm like, well, it really doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. What matters,
everyone was speaking to angels back then, weren't they, Michael?
Well, there were lots of people that claiming this, right? But it really doesn't matter. What matters is that she convinced others to believe that she did. That's what made her who she is, right? You can claim to be whatever, but if nobody follows you, like, no big deal. She convinced others that this was so, and it changed history because they relieve the siege of Orleans. They just start mopping up the English. She opens up the road so that the Dauphin can be crowned King of France. She does all this in just a very, very short period of time. Now, her story ends rather tragically. She gets captured, gets sold into English hands, is ultimately put on trial, declared a heretic, and burned at the stake. It's a horrific ending for this young woman.
Did that really happen, do you think?
Oh, it absolutely happened. Oh, there's no question. Yeah, there's no question. That happened. All that is simple fact. What's debatable, I suppose, again, I don't think it really matters, is, whether or not she truly was, doing the will of God here. That's kind of a question of faith. But there's no question of that she was real. There was no question that she won. There was no question of her being caught. We know where she was caught. I could stand on there. She was caught right here. She was held in that cell. She was. We know where it all happened. She was burned. We have the trial transcripts. The trial transcripts are extraordinary. They wrote everything down during the long and drawn out trial that ultimately declared her guilty of heresy. We know all that to be true. What she becomes, obviously, is something bigger than that. She becomes a kind of myth that people use to determine their own ability and their own identity. And as you said, in France, she's
the most modern figure, perhaps, in the whole narrative.
She's amazing, and yeah, some people see her as a proto-feminist. Some people, again, we kind of use her as a mirror, right? People want to see in the past something of themselves.
Yeah, what we want, we find in Joan of Arc. I'm thinking out loud here, Michael, so please correct me if this is a dumb question, but in the 15th and certainly the 16th and 17th century, Europe was racked by religious civil wars, particularly the wars of the Reformation. Again, don't need me to tell you this. Would it be fair to say, though, that the 100 Years' War was not a religious civil war? In other words, there was no Martin Luther, there was no Reformation, there weren't doctrinal issues here. What was the attitude of the church? Was there a religious component to this, given that it was such a deeply religious world and society?
Not at the start, but it becomes that. Partway through this conflict, you have the papal schism, in which we end up with two popes, one in Avignon, France, and one in Rome. And almost predictably, the French go for one, the English go for the other. They're excommunicating each other. It becomes,
and Avignon is, of course, in the south of France. I'm guessing it was the English who went with Rome and the French with the Pope in Avignon.
Yeah, absolutely. So it becomes for a period of time.
But was there a doctrinal quality, or was it just simply a sort of a religious version of dynastic dispute?
I think they would have seen it as doctrinal. I think from the kind of terminology we would use, it's more akin to a dynastic dispute. The sides aren't really disagreeing on the rule set. They're more disagreeing on who gets to make the call, right? Who's Pope. So yeah, in that sense, it's more dynastic. They would have seen it, I think, through their lens as being fundamentally doctrinal. But also, it's worth saying that the chaos of all this also leads to a number of what we often call proto-reformist movements, like in England and elsewhere. Those initial steps towards what's going to become the Reformation. Those actually transpire in the middle of this same period as well. There's kind of nothing that is untouched by this conflict, in part because it drags on for so long, and that ends up, I used the word metastasizing earlier. That cuts across society, culture, religion. It ends up touching everything because it keeps going and is unresolved, the underlying problems.
Yeah, and I don't suppose that war between, or the dispute between Avignon and Rome, I'm sure it didn't do a great deal for the brand of the Roman Catholic Church, which may explain why, as you say, it metastasized later into the Reformation. This is one of the 7 longest wars. I found this on the internet, in world history. In fact, only 7 wars have lasted over 100 years. I'm not sure how many wars have lasted 200 years. Michael, why did it last such a long time? And again, when one thinks of 100 years war, we're not thinking of a 100-year or 200-year war like the First World War, of millions of men fighting each other over a river. How sporadic was this war, and why did it last so long?
Yeah, so it's a war that has sort of really, really hot moments, right? These big campaigns, and where you have 10 years of really heavy, horrible fighting, and then there's a break, and then it hits again. Part of that is happening because you don't have the impetus, the economics, the population to sustain it over the whole thing. It also, because it drags on so long, you have different personalities involved, right? Different princes are interested in doing different things with their power. And because it's gotten so big that it's not just a single front, right? The fight between England and Scotland is part of this fight. It's absolutely part of this fight.
And the Scots were, of course, allies of the French, as they've always been.
Yes, exactly. So, William Wallace, Robert the Bruce, all that is part of the 200 Years of War. The fight with Owain Glyndŵr.
So it's officially a 200 years war now. We've shifted from the 100 to 200.
I think it is. I think it's best to call it that. Obviously, that's the argument I'm making in the book. But yeah, Owain in Wales, the Battle of Nahara, what's going on the Iberian Peninsula, what we would call Spain today. All of that, it's the same fight. So it's also a fight that, if you're simply looking at one front, it's kind of hot and cold. But if you look at the global picture of the fight, it just heat's moving around, right? It's not just in one spot. So in that respect, it really is, I think, again, important to look on this bigger scale. So that's part of the reason why it seems like it kind of ebbs and flows. Is part of that is our own perspective on how we're defining it. Why does it not resolve for so long? Well, in part because what it's really about. And that's the fundamental question that led me to redefine it. I sincerely believe this is a fight about France defining itself. And France is not going to be satisfied with that fight being done until we essentially get something like the modern borders of France. That is what
now
happens.
You've explained why you're not the number 1 release in French history, Michael.
I suppose that's why. I don't know.
We should be singing the Marseillaise.
I didn't make that call, but good to know I'm number 1. Go team.
Speaking of the global context, could one argue, especially the way in which we're rethinking a lot of the Western-centric narratives of global history, could one argue that this was still very much of a sideshow to a sideshow, that the real civilizations, the powerful military innovation, all the stuff that was really happening was to the east, to the rising Ottoman Empire, which would eventually conquer much of Central Europe, bring down the Holy Roman Empire, conquer Constantinople, the Islamic world, even China, which I don't remember the year that Marco Polo, quote unquote, discovered it, but he found something way in advance of European civilization. So would it be fair to say that maybe this is important for France and England and maybe the long-term future of Western Europe, but in world historical terms, this was still a relatively minor sideshow?
I mean, I suppose one could say that. I don't know that I would, in part because I think there's a lot of danger in siloing these things, right? To think about what's happening in Constantinople without thinking about what's happening in Western Europe is to imagine that these histories are entirely independent of one
And
another.
Constantinople, of course, is now what we call Istanbul. It was the heart of the Holy Roman Empire.
Not the Holy Roman Empire, but the
Sorry,
Eastern,
the Eastern Empire.
the Eastern Empire, Byzantine Empire, whatever you want to call it. Yeah, Holy Roman Empire is more centered in Germany. But yeah, you can't sort of divide those histories. We tend to silo them because books and things, right? So in my case, I've got 170,000 words that I can't go beyond to tell this story. So I kind of have to cut some stuff out of the narrative and simply kind of gesture towards it. But that doesn't mean that they're not deeply affected by it, right? This whole period, we've got Crusades, we've got all this
Right. And the Crusades, of course, are the prelude, I guess, to the 100-Year War. But coming back to my question, let's all English schoolboys know the story of Agincourt, but in military and technological terms, was it as innovative as it's presented? I mean, was it as remarkable compared to some of the wars that might have been taking place, I don't know, in Persia or China or India?
Agincourt is fascinating. I've actually separately written an entire book on the Battle of Agincourt. It's really a fascinating fight. And
you've also written on Crecy, another of the great battles.
Yes, I have. Yeah. Agincourt is fascinating, not only on its kind of own right. How is that Henry V wins a battle there that he by all rights should not have won, and wins big. And that's an absolutely fascinating thing on just kind of a military tactical level. But it's also fascinating in the way that Agincourt has grown beyond what it was, right? For the English, I mean, this is the national myth in so many ways.
It's our Joan of Arc, or British, Britain, England's Joan of Arc in military terms.
Yeah, I think that's as fair as I can tell, right? I'm not English.
That's a kind of miracle.
Yeah, and it's really held up, and Henry V is then therefore kind of held up, and Shakespeare, pretty good writer, pretty good, not going to take anything away from him. Tells a good story, and it's full of great lines. Band of Brothers speech, the whole thing, it's amazing, but it has now sort of become bigger than the event itself, and that doesn't, I don't think, mean that we should diminish it, right? And say, oh no, it's not that important. No, it is that important because of what it has meant, right? There's a reason that on the cusp of D-Day, right, we're putting out Laurence Olivier's Henry V, the story of Agincourt, because it has that national impulse. Yes, is it accurate to the actual events? Well, not at all, but it nevertheless has a cultural power, and that cultural power has an enormous impact on the world, as it did at D-Day.
Yeah, and Agincourt, of course, we never probably had Winston Churchill without Agincourt. There are a lot of remarkable characters. Talked about Henry V, Joan of Arc. There were some very bad people as well. There was Edward the Black Prince, for example. How violent and unpleasant. I mean, if you watch the Monty Python films, some of these characters seem particularly unpleasant. Was there a lot of bloodthirstiness, a lot of slaughter, a lot of people boiling oil on one another, or are we again over dramatizing this war, Michael?
It's terrifically violent, terrifically violent. And one of the things I try to do in the book, as I try to do in all my book, from Crecy, Agincourt, all these, is I try to sort of present that horror as it would have been lived by sort of the regular folk. I think one of the things we do too often, and again, it's necessary, right, to talk about sort of big things. I do it in the book too. Henry V did this, Henry V did that. Well, I mean, Henry V did it, but also he had thousands of people with him who were bleeding and killing and going through all this trauma to make that act happen. And I try as much as possible to get that lens as well, to get the lens of the ordinary person caught up in all this. What was it like for the people in France who they're just trying to go about their lives, and armies are marching back and forth and taking everything that they own and destroying their crops in order to get at the other side, and whatever it is, all that slaughter and brutality. What is that like? And what is that also doing even to the soldiers themselves in terms of their trauma? I think we too often ignore that, and I've tried within the bounds of the publishing limit of what a printing press can take, to tell those stories too, so that we can get a better picture of who we were, right? What was this really like, and that it wasn't just all pretty banners and knights in shining armor. That there really was a horrific darkness to this, as there is in any war. No war is clean and pretty. That's not what warfare is.
Was there an element, though, of chivalry? This was, shall we say, the ideology, at least, of both sides, the chivalrous knight. Is that another myth?
It's not a myth, but what I would say about chivalry, the same thing I would say about honor, is it's a great ideal when it's convenient. And when it's not convenient, one finds ways to say that doesn't really work now, right? And this is the same with, again, just about any kind of rule of engagement, as it were, that in warfare, in historical warfare, time and again, we see that, this is the rules, and we're going to have this kind of conduct. Well, it's not convenient to do that now, so maybe we'll look the other way and change those rules for the moment. That is human behavior, and we certainly see it in this period where these great chivalric figures will turn around and do something absolutely extraordinarily awful, and not really bat an eye. It's okay. I mean, Henry V at Agincourt orders the wholesale slaughter of the French prisoners that he's taken, because he's afraid he's going to get attacked by another French army and is not going to have the men to defend, and so he just orders these innocent men slaughtered. That's not chivalrous. That's not honorable.
It's interesting thinking out loud. Remember those scenes from Thucydides' Peloponnesian War, the 100 or the 200 Years' War. It never really had a Thucydides, did it?
It doesn't.
In the sense of a historian at the time describing what happened.
Yeah, I mean, what you have is lots of sort of smaller Thucydides, one might say. I mean, Jean Froissart, is writing in the middle of all this, and his story is absolutely extraordinary. It's an extraordinary piece of work. Jean Lebel, who actually Froissart uses, there are voices that do that, but I don't think there's any that sort of encapsulate the entirety the way that we imagine, like a Thucydides does. And again, that's partly because nobody kind of thought they were in the middle of this, right? It was never declared. There was never like, oh, this is what we're really fighting over. It's instead this more nebulous fight. I've tried to give it shape, but it's not in that same kind of, well, this is the Peloponnesian War, and this is what we're fighting about. It doesn't really have that underpinning.
I live in San Francisco, as I think I mentioned to you before we went live. When one wanders around some parts of town, there's a medieval quality. The 100 Years' War, of course, was one of the defining events of the Middle Ages, what is sometimes called the medieval world. What does your study of this 100 Years' War tell us about the Middle Ages, the medieval period? So much has been written. You're focused on this war. Might it suggest, to borrow again from the title of our conversation with Richard Overy, has the Middle Ages ended yet, Michael?
Well, yeah, I suppose so. But what are the Middle Ages? I mean, you flashed up there a second ago, the Wikipedia article. I think it said circa 500 to 1500. Sure. Maybe. What? Yeah, there you go. Circa 550. Yep, right. Maybe. I could get 5 medievalists in a room, and we'd probably have 20 different opinions on what the Middle Ages even is, right? And it's our specialty. Again, nobody declared it finished or
That's
ended.
maybe why they call it the Dark Ages, because no one can agree on even what it was or when it started and when it ended.
Yeah. So yeah, the Dark Ages is actually the early Middle Ages, in which we have so few sources, and it's very dark to us. The people then obviously knew quite a lot about their world, but we're sort of in the darkness. Yeah. The did it end? I mean, did any period of history really end? Right. I mean, obviously, that idea, are we still fighting the Second World War? Well, it depends on how you define the Second World War. Overy obviously really, I think, quite perceptively, I think very fascinatingly, opens that up a little bit. And I think that's very worthwhile. And it's a very good book and a very good conversation you had with him. But that, even so, he could have opened that further, right? I mean, we could take that all the way to now. And I think that's the same with any kind of historical periodization, because the periodization is only as good as we use it for.
Yeah, and all historians, of course, again, you don't need me to tell you this, are prisoners of their own age, of their own culture, of their own zeitgeist. I'm assuming that in our age, Michael, which tends to be a little more pessimistic, a little less optimistic about progress, the teleology of progress, which has driven our sense of Western history over the last few centuries. I'm guessing that your generation of historians are looking at this 100 or 200 years war slightly differently from 18th or 19th or even 20th century historians.
I think absolutely that's the case. And I don't know that it's, sort of a conscious thing or not, but, I think inevitably, as more work is done and more sources come to light, right, there's whole archives that haven't been touched. It's very easy to think about, the material of the past kind of, well, we already know everything. We just don't. We don't know where some of these biggest, most incredible fights were even fought. We're still finding sources. We're still finding material. And each one of those gives us a fuller picture. So just at the level of material to work with, we are constantly needing to reconfigure our understanding of the past. But I think, yeah, beyond that, there is certainly more of an awareness of, kind of looking at the past, I would say kind of with eyes open, as opposed to, just trying to look at it through a nationalistic lens or through a progressive lens. Things were so bad, and history has this sort of trajectory to the ultimate awesomeness that is I. I think we've lost a lot of that as a culture, and that kind of sucks, but is also good. I mean, we shouldn't think of ourselves in that privileged position, but it is nevertheless kind of beholden on us to go back and look at these past events then and say, well, did we get it right? What were we thinking? What were they thinking? And really kind of interrogate, ourselves and the lenses through which we're seeing the past. And that's important because that's how we define ourselves in the end.
Yeah, and I'm pleased that you haven't said anything about this being a war about democracy. If there is one question, you said we still don't know a great deal, sometimes where even the battles were. If there's one unanswered question about this period that you would like to answer, what is it?
Oh my goodness. I've never been asked that question, man. That's a hell of a good question. What would be the one thing I wish I knew about this period? I honestly, I wish that I had access to all the pieces. I know that's general, but too often when you get back into the medieval period in particular, we only have one side of something. So, if you think about the Battle of the Somme, for instance, to use something kind of more recent, we have lots of sources from both sides. We kind of know what each side is thinking. Very often in the medieval period, we only have one side, and that is tremendously detrimental to trying to understand what's happening. So, if you in reading my book, you see I spend a lot of time, as much as I can, trying to sort of wrestle with that and showing the readers that the act of that wrestling that we have to do to try and get the bigger picture. because I think it's important for people to understand that, and we don't usually understand that. So that'd be the big thing is just almost for any moment, I wish I had two sides of it, and too often I've only got one. The number of events where you have both sides is really, really quite small percentage wise.
Well, let's end with a question that I'm sure you've had many times. In fact, you teach at the Citadel, one of the top military colleges in the United States in Charleston. So this is probably goes with your day job as their distinguished professor. The real question then is, what does this 100 or 200-year war in 800 years ago in distant Europe, in Western Europe, when there was England and France, these sort of proto-nations, what the hell, Michael, does this have to do with American military history or training or thinking in the mid-2020s? For upcoming generals or brigadiers who are at the Citadel, why should they want to read your book? How will it help the American military?
Well, I suppose I could order them, outrank them, so that'll work. But outside of that, I wouldn't do that for sales. But it truly, to understand,
you'd have to be careful. One of them might turn out to be the Black Prince.
Yeah. So yeah, the idea of kind of understanding who we are, right? So as Americans, as I am, well, what has the American Revolution to do with me? Well, in one sense, kind of not much, because I'm not fighting that anymore. On the other hand, it's pretty essential to where I am, who I am, the way I speak, all of that. And I think you kind of step that back in military history, and we see that same process unfolding, right? This 200 years fight, this defines England, it defines France, it determines what's going to happen over the next centuries as this fight becomes global. And that global fight is, to keep going back to Overy, this becomes the fight of the 20th century. Well, what does that have to do with the 21st century? It builds the landscape, and we're still struggling with the outcomes of that. So in many respects, to kind of come back to what you said earlier, is this war that I've written a book about kind of done? I mean, in one sense, no, it's not. In that sense, wars never really end. We're simply in one long continuous spectrum of struggling with each other and with ourselves.
So maybe we should call it. Maybe you should have called it the 700 Years War, Michael.
I thought about starting this with the breaking up of Pangea, and just start there and run it forward. Again, there's only so many words in a book. Well,
there's always other books. Maybe that will be your next book. Michael Livingstone, congratulations. Fascinating new book. Wonderful discussion on an event many hundreds of years ago that may still be enormously significant. Bloody Crowns. It's out today in the US. It was out a couple of weeks ago in the US. In the UK, it's called The 200 Years War. It's already, as I said earlier, it's #1 in French history on Amazon, and I'm sure it will soon become #1 in English history too. So